everyone. Even though I prefer being introduced as a novelist, I should probably add that I work for the Center for Syrian Studies. They always emphasize that I should do this at University of St. Andrews. So I hereby share this with you. Okay, so going on now back to the subject today of Western policy. You know, this is a really fascinating subject and almost surreal in its various dynamics and implications. It brings me back, you know, not too long ago we heard President Trump suddenly and abruptly say he's withdrawn from Syria. And this brought me back to 1990. And, you know, I don't know how many of you, you're probably much younger than that, but back in 1990, an American ambassador named April Glaspie met the president of Iraq. And she emphasized, we have absolutely no problem with you. You know, this issue between you and Kuwait, the northern border, is meaningless to us. In fact, it's not part of our security and national security concerns. Leaving the president of Iraq was this impression that he, in essence, had a green light to cross into the border, which he, of course, did. What the ambassador left for him to understand in a very subtle way is that, but if you do, we will not only bombard your entire army, but we will also impose sanctions on you for 13 years. And we won't stop there. Then we will actually enter the country, we'll destroy it, we'll rip apart the state, and then we'll leave it in the shape we see Iraq today, a broken country. So, in the midst of this fascinating narrative, we have in 1990 those who believed George Bush Sr., the call to rise up against oppression, only to find that there were the president of Iraq was still allowed to use helicopters to machine gun all the protesters who had actually believed in this idea that they can find support in the strongest country on earth. But you see, what's really fascinating is just how often this narrative repeats itself. And if there's any term that seems to encapsulate what we call Western policy, or the lack of a Western policy, is trust us if you dare. And I think no one really noticed this and understood this as much as the Syrians on the ground protesting from 2011 onwards. Trust us if you dare, because we'll come out and we'll actually acknowledge in the clearest terms that what is taking place on the ground is immoral, that this regime has lost legitimacy, and then we have all these terminology acrobatic games about stepping down, resigning, losing credibility, losing legitimacy, all the while instilling within the imagination of young Syrian men and women the idea that something is about to happen, that we will not be left alone. But you see, that's where the entire story is, in this false expectation of something about to happen. Because if you study the way in which foreign policy works, usually, if you have taken some of these international relations courses 101, they basically fall in the following categories. It's either an idealist policy, that is, it's principled, it works against a certain set of, what you might call idealist principles or morals, universal values, or it's practical. But when it comes to whatever we are observing, whether in Iraq or in Syria or most recently in Venezuela, we as analysts, we have trouble putting it in any category. If anything, it seems to be impulsive. It's neither idealist, obviously, because after all, everyone can get away with anything. Even the very regime in Syria, which we are told by the very Western countries that are creating these policies, has committed war crimes, etc., chemical warfare. You read what I read, and I believe it. But that's not the point. The point is the very countries that actually articulate these positions are the very countries that have secret security meetings just 6 months ago in Damascus airport, with the very regime that has lost credibility, that has all of this, that. So clearly it's not principled, but then it's not even practical, because what are the clear specific objectives that have actually been pursued in a systematic manner since 2011, insofar as Syria is concerned, and have actually been actualized. We fail to capture one meaningful course of events that could actually take us from A to Z when it comes to where this story is going, what they're trying to achieve. We go right, lost credibility. Then we go left, we will have an agreement and get rid of the stockpile of chemical warfare. As though the vast majority of Syrians were being killed by chemical warfare. What about the barrel bombs, for God's sake? What about all the various, we become obsessed with a modality of killing, although the killing in itself is irrelevant. Kill as you will, just do not kill using chlorine. No, we have this allergy towards that. It plays with our head. But otherwise, you can keep doing whatever you're doing because that's irrelevant. But do not use chlorine or sarin. That's very dangerous. Although it's the normalization of a specific modality of killing that is really at stake. But Syrians are not. Because if they were, then we would have an equal concern about other modalities of killing. But we don't. So even on a pure, and then even on that level, even when it comes to chemical warfare, we find the Syrian regime, which of course it can never accept by its very nature to be disciplined. You can't discipline a regime of this type. It will not allow you, because to be disciplined is to look small vis-a-vis its local audience. So it becomes emphatically stubborn in its insistence on reusing the very weapon it was not supposed to use. And we see this over and over and over again. And so even on that practical level of preventing one specific modality of killing, we find Western policy to have completely and utterly failed. But then they don't really care. And I'll tell you why they don't care, because we're not important enough. I think the grand mistake Syrian protesters made is to think that Syria was important enough for Western policy to either be morally cohesive towards it or practically consistent towards it. It's neither. The West, when it comes to a country like Syria or Venezuela or Iraq, can afford to be impulsive. They can afford to experiment. We'll try this. It doesn't really matter if it doesn't work. This is not really, it doesn't constitute what they call a strategic security concern. In the final analysis, Syria can, disappear for all that they care. It's not relevant in this sense. And so we can pull into one illusion over another. And when we look at the phenomena of the so-called Arab Spring, the only country that escaped this narrative of will they intervene, will they not intervene? And if they do intervene, what will it look like, i.e. Libya? So this entire mess of intervention or lack thereof was fortunately escaped by one country, that is Tunisia. And in Tunisia, the events went so fast that Western intervention or the lack thereof, a Western policy of any cohesive level or the lack thereof, was irrelevant, because the events on the ground were far faster than to make this narrative relevant. And in this sense, the only successful experiment that we could, so far point at, insofar as again this phenomenon of the Arab Spring, is Tunisia. And it brings back the story to where it really should be returned. When you speak to my Syrian friends and colleagues, there's this constant frustration that the West failed us. But if you really allow yourself, and I speak as a Syrian, to take responsibility, I think Syrians failed Syrians, because the real narrative is internal. And unless we understand it as such, this constant addiction to externalizing the perception of this, the solution does not lie in what the West will do or will not do. I'll give you an additional example. Reconstruction. We are now constantly, the new, the Syrian uprising goes into what we might call fads, and each one has a term by which it goes by. So now the latest is reconstruction. And And reconstruction is just it's yet another surreal subject, because we will not reconstruct until a process begins. Or we will reconstruct, because after all, we are aligned with the regime, China, Russia, etc., Iran. But in the final analysis, we sit here and wait. And what are we waiting for? Look at the grand examples of reconstruction that have been led by the West. Take Afghanistan, for example. One surreal story after another. Take Iraq. Iraq has this fascinating story where, in the midst of reconstructing Iraq, they want to have a pipe under the Tigris River. And all the studies tell them they should not do this. It doesn't work. The soil is not compatible. But the company that wants to sell its products must create this particular pipe. Because after all, this is what it creates. This is what it manufactures. So after billions of dollars lost, and about 3.5 years of waiting, they finally reached a conclusion which was reached from the very beginning, that they should not have even attempted this. Or take for another example, at a time in Iraq when unemployment is over 60%, during the so-called reconstruction phase, foreign labor is brought from Eritrea and Ethiopia into Iraq rather than recruiting the local population. These are the grand examples of reconstruction. And yet we wait. We are now yet waiting all over again. In the same vein, we waited for intervention. Now we wait for reconstruction. And even as we are fully aware that when this took place, it does not take place in a manner that is consistent with the best interest of the country at work. So again, we can keep talking about Western policy. In the final analysis, as I tried to summarize to you, it's neither idealist nor is it practical. It treats us with indifference because we're not important enough. And for countries that are not important enough, the worst thing you can do, as is now repeating itself yet again in Venezuela, is to believe the type of rhetoric that the West produces. The West would be far more interested in ideas related to terrorism, and in this sense is still willing to coordinate with the very regimes it has categorized as entirely and completely not credible morally. So, to wrap up, there is no Western policy that can be described as a thought-out, systematic approach towards what took place in Syria. And what took place in Syria is predominantly authored by Syrians within. And coming to terms with this reality is the beginning of a real change in what is taking place on the ground and what has been taking place since at least 1963. A tragic political nightmare that has deep roots in a system that is capable easily, by the way, this notion of Assad. You can get rid of Assad easily and you will still have the same system. It's a system with deep roots, with a very specific dynamics. And that's where the story is. And no Western policy will be capable of changing this unless it's changed from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I'll pass the mic on to you. There's no mic.
Thank you for attending this session. And